I'm Donald MacPherson. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition. I know that's a mouthful, I can hardly say it myself. And we're a project that's located at Simon Fraser University over at Harbour Centre in the Faculty of Health Sciences, and we're a national network of organizations and individuals working to change and improve Canada's approach to drugs. We are very happy to be a co-sponsor of this event, along with the Pivot Legal Society and SNAP, SALOME, NAOMI Association of Patients, and have to give a big shout out to Am and his team at Simon Fraser, Am Johel and his team at Simon Fraser's University for their support for this event and helping us get this room and get it to sound so good. So we welcome you all tonight. I also want to honor the First Nations of the region with an acknowledgement that this event is taking place on the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. Welcome to the unceded territories as well. We have an amazing event within a heartbreaking and tragic context here in British Columbia, in Vancouver, in Alberta, in Ontario, and in other parts of the country. I'm not surprised the room is full. The organization sponsoring this event have been working for many years to try and improve the response to the whole range of problematic issues when it comes to drugs and communities and criminalization. So this is another important node in that struggle to bring universal health care to all Canadians and evidence-based treatment to people who are looking for help with addiction issues. So we have an amazing group of people, and we decided that it's really hot up here under the lights, and we're not going to make the panel sit up here through the whole evening. We're going to invite people up to speak when it's their turn on the panel. Our first presenter will be Dr. Susan Boyd, a distinguished professor in the Faculty of Human and Social Development, University of Victoria. Our second presenter will be Douglas King from the Pivot Legal Society. Our third presenter will be Dr. D. Scott MacDonald. Okay. I'm intrigued by the D. What is it? Donald. Like my name. Donald! So lovely to meet you, lad. Scott MacDonald is the physician lead at Providence Crosstown Clinic, which was the site of the NAOMI and SALOME clinical trials. And I'll say a few more words about all of these people as they come up to speak. Dave Murray over here, you can recognize him by his brand new sling. But it's a dislocated, no, it's a broken collarbone. Yeah, collarbones happen to do that once in a while. And Dave is the founder of the SALOME NAOMI Association of Patients, who've been very involved in advocacy for improved treatment for people with addictions in Vancouver, BC, and Canada over the years. And then we'll have Ora Famoen. Is that a Danish name, Ora? Norwegian, sorry. The Danes and the Norwegians don't like to get mixed up. Fagmoen. Ah, okay. Ora has worked at Insight for 5 years, and currently as a casual supervisor, Ora is also a longtime member of the SNAP, SALOME NAOMI Association of Patients. SNAP, we'll just call it from now on, and a resident of Downtown Eastside. And then Greg Frez, who is sitting back here at the back, is also a SNAP liaison to the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users, VANDU board. And we'd also like to thank VANDU for their support of this event. So, I've had the privilege of working with Susan Boyd for many years. When I was the City of Vancouver Drug Policy Coordinator, and then in working with starting an organization, the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition 5 years ago, and always being totally amazed at the incredible integrity of her work. She's the author of a number of articles and books on drug issues. Her most recent books are From Witches to Crack Bombs, Women, Drug Law, and Policy, and a co-author of Raise Shit, Social Action Saving Lives, of which I'm a co-author too, so I'm very proud to say that. But the real spiritual author of that book was Bud Osborne, the late Bud Osborne, who many of the people in this room will agree with is probably one of the most fiercest, intelligent, committed activists ever to walk the streets of Vancouver, and is a reason why a lot of the good stuff that's happened in Vancouver has happened. So Susan's going to come up and give a brief presentation to sort of set the context of this discussion. And then after all the presentations, we will have a Q&A.
I'm just going to start off with a little history of what is heroin so that we can better understand what heroin-assisted treatment is. And just to summarize that, heroin-assisted treatment is a highly restricted and medicalized opioid maintenance substitution drug treatment, which you'll hear about from all of our panelists. But since the 1990s, successful HAT programs have been established in Switzerland, Denmark, the Netherlands, the UK, and Germany. And it's pretty well restricted to people where conventional treatments didn't work for them, like methadone maintenance programs or Suboxone or abstinence-based programs. But just so that we can understand a little bit better about heroin, I want to start with a historical background about opiate-based drugs and heroin so we can understand the type of treatment options that we could have available. And historically, all drug medicines were plant-based, such as opium from the opium poppy. And opium-based medicines were used for many illnesses and healing for centuries. And so here's just a picture of a woodcut from the 1600s extracting the sap or the juice from the poppy plant. And in the 1700s, laudanum became very popular, and it's a tincture of opium, and it was used for intestinal ailments, coughs, pain, by both the rich and poor. And early on, health professionals and doctors wrote about the benefits of these drugs. And people in Canada use laudanum and opium-based drugs because doctors were few and far between. We were a rural country at that time. We didn't have a medical plan, either a public, medical. There's also Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, and that was used for children that were teething or had intestinal problems. And these plant-based drugs were available in mail order, through Simpson's and the Hudson's Bay, and they were advertised, as you can see, but they were without a prescription at that time. So this is from 1899. And many people had a home medicine chest where they would have opiate-based drugs and stimulants like ginger and lavender and other types of herbs that they would use to take care of their family's health. But in 1803, we saw a change. A German chemist isolated the organic compound or alkaloid morphine from opium. And that's the first time an active compound was isolated from a plant. And so we know that most plants, like the coca plant, the cannabis plant, they're made up of compounds and alkaloids. And so to isolate, a compound from a plant started the beginning of what we would call our pharmaceutical industry. So in 1898, Bayer's pharmaceutical company discovered heroin. And basically, heroin is a semi-synthetic, is what we call it. I'm just going to move my pages here to where that is, because on the screen it's not showing my notes. Anyway, advertisements for Bayer for cough, pain, intestinal disorders, and other common ailments were in trade magazines and at storefronts as well. And so what we see from this time on was that chemists and scientists were now trying to create semi-synthetic drugs and synthetic drugs such as fentanyl that are not plant-based as the pharmaceutical industry takes off. And here's just another advertisement for Bayer heroin. Meanwhile, in British Columbia in the late 1800s and the 1900s, white settlers were very active, discriminating against indigenous nations on the lower mainland and throughout BC, and discriminating against Chinese and Japanese and South Asian people. Because the white settlers that came from Europe and the UK at that time envisioned a white Canada, a white British Columbia. And this led to many restrictions on where Chinese and Japanese and South Asian people and First Nations people could live, where they could work. They weren't allowed to vote. We had the Chinese head tax and many other legal acts of discrimination. Well, in 1907, there was a labor and anti-Asian demonstration in Vancouver, just down the street from here, where white workers broke off and they destroyed homes and businesses in what was Chinatown and Japantown. And this led to an investigation by the Minister of Labor, who was Mackenzie King at that time, to compensate homeowners and business owners for the destruction that happened. But when Mackenzie King was here in Vancouver, he actually met with some moral reformers who wanted to see the smoking of opium banned. So he went back to Ottawa, and he's recorded as saying, "I'll get some good out of this right yet." And he recommended that we criminalize opium for non-medical use. And so our first narcotic law was enacted in 1908, and then it was strengthened in 1911. And due to these sort of vocal reformers around the smoking of opium, they linked opium smoking to dangerous opium dens, and that Chinese men were corrupting white moral women, and that they were leading them astray to smoke opium, and they'd quickly become addicted and lose all moral sense of themselves. They would abandon their family, and eventually that would destabilize the nation. So in the backdrop of this as well, in Canada, US, and in the UK, there was a temperance movement that was really fueling up as well. And it was linked to the anti-opiate movement. But they espoused that sobriety and self-control was the template of middle-class Protestant respectability. So many scholars talk about our drug laws, the early laws and later laws that were based on race, class, and gender tensions, and also biases and myths about non-white people. And we saw that as the years went on, the laws expanded to include more drugs, police powers, and bigger budgets. And what we could say about our Canadian drug policy is that the policy that we've created is primarily a criminal justice approach rather than a public health or what we might call a harm reduction approach today. And so people became criminals overnight when we criminalized opium, morphine, cocaine, heroin for non-medical purposes. And originally, Chinese men were arrested and deported. And when the opium dens closed and heroin and morphine became the drug of choice for a very small group of poor and working class users. And these users were labeled the criminal addict. And what that meant in the literature by the RCMP who developed the term was that they were criminals first and then addicts secondly. And so it was felt like there was no point to give them any type of maintenance or drug treatment, because even if you did that, even if they abstained, they would still be criminals and a threat to society. So we didn't set up any public funded drug treatment after we criminalized drugs. And the RCMP and doctors at that time were adamant that narcotic maintenance was wrong and that abstinence should be the only avenue that was open for people. But that meant abstinence in a jail cell, withdrawal in a jail cell, and for the wealthy, that they could possibly go to a private asylum. We also had laws that were enacted in 1925 where there was a penalty to prescribe to a person who was a known addict for maintenance purposes, and it was a 5-year penalty, and that law was strengthened again in 1929. So these moral prejudice continue today about our ideas about people who use criminalized drugs and the options for treatment. But in other countries, they were doing things quite differently. In fact, in the United States, we often think of them as being the most prohibitionist. Clinics opened up right after they criminalized narcotics in the United States, and over 40 clinics, state clinics and municipal clinics, opened up to work with people who were addicted to these newly criminalized drugs. And interesting enough, abstinence wasn't the goal of these clinics. In fact, it was a prevention of suffering. That was the basis of setting up the clinics. And after the federal government closed the clinics, 2 federally funded narcotic farms were opened up, the first in 1935 in Lexington, Kentucky. And there's a lot of literature about them, and I'm not going to go into it, but you could go voluntarily or you were sentenced, through the criminal justice system to go there as well. But our first drug treatment was not out in the public, and it was not publicly funded. It was in the prisons in the 1950s. We set up 1 or 2 programs in the prisons. And it wasn't until later, the late 50s and the 60s, that we started to fund public treatment for people. And even then, it was quite narrow and restricted, the type of treatment that we set up. It was abstinent-based. And so for many people who use narcotics or other drugs that were criminalized, in BC anyway, Ocala Prison Farm was where they ended up. And I want to speak to Ocala because I think it's interesting. We had in the 1950s a special Senate committee on the trafficking in drugs. And the Senate committee representatives went to Ocala Prison. And there in the prison chapel, 150 male prisoners came together, and they had representatives speaking for them. And they told the Senate representatives that without exception, they all advocated the legal provision of drugs, such as heroin. But unfortunately, at that time, their wisdom was rejected. But we did see a huge expansion in the 1960s and the 1970s in relation to treatment, methadone maintenance programs, often in cities. Yet these programs were quite rigid too, and stigmatizing as well. And then, as most of you know, due to our failure to create diverse services for people and to reform our criminal law, in the Downtown Eastside in the early 1990s, an epidemic emerged. An epidemic of drug overdose deaths, HIV/AIDS, and hepatitis C epidemic. And for people who lived through that epidemic at that time, we never thought we would be in the same place again today, and even worse overdose death rates, and people dying every week, not only in Vancouver, but across Canada. Due to the efforts of activists, some of those people in the room, there were calls on the federal government to open a supervised injection sites across Canada and for heroin-assisted treatment. And Vandu was a large part of that effort to change drug law, to end drug prohibition, but to also set up HAT and safer injection sites. There was also the Framework for Action in 2001, which Donald MacPherson, our moderator, authored and was an instrumental part of that whole movement to bring harm reduction to Vancouver and for it to become a word that we all knew what it meant. And a huge critique of drug prohibition in Canada. And in that report, among many of its other recommendations, they also recommended that heroin-assisted treatment be set up and safer injection sites. So we all know that Insight opened up in 2003, but we didn't get heroin-assisted treatment. But internationally, there are already nations that had set up heroin-assisted treatment clinical trials and permanent programs, and what they found was that heroin-assisted treatment was a safe, effective treatment for a certain percent of people who were long-term addicted to narcotics. And in Vancouver, finally, a clinical trial opened up, not a program, but a clinical trial. The NAOMI clinical trial opened its doors in Vancouver and Montreal. But unfortunately, at the end of the clinical trial, a permanent program, a permanent heroin-assisted treatment program wasn't set up. So I just wanted other people to speak to the results, but it's just to say that the clinical trials findings were very positive, and they mirrored what we saw internationally in terms of HAT. So just to conclude, another clinical trial opened its doors in 2011, but again, it lacked a plan for a permanent HAT program at the end of the trial. And so a lot of activism happened. Many of those people and organizations are here in the room again. SNAP organized to advocate for heroin-assisted treatment, Pivot, Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, physicians at Crosstown Clinic, and we want to acknowledge that Dr. Scott MacDonald and Dr. McDermott at the Crosstown Clinic, are unsung heroes in relation to heroin-assisted treatment. So I'll leave it to the rest of the panelists to fill in the other gaps and expand on the issues that they want to bring to us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for setting the stage. How many people in the audience knew all about heroin-assisted? No. How many people in the audience didn't know anything about heroin-assisted treatment when they came in the door tonight? Okay, a few. Welcome, great. You're going to know a lot about it by the time you leave the room. And everyone else is going to know more than they know now. So we're going to move on to Doug King. Doug King's a lawyer at the Pivot Legal Society, one of the co-sponsors of tonight's event. He entered law school at UBC, focused on a career in international human rights. However, as he spent more time in Vancouver, he is originally from Salt Lake City, Utah. I didn't know that. Douglas became deeply aware of the complicated human rights and constitutional issues in his own community, right in his own backyard. Douglas worked as an advocate for the Downtown Eastside Residents Association before moving over to Pivot in 2008. Douglas's job at Pivot places him at the heart of police and private security accountability, using civil litigation and the charter to influence the policies and practices of police departments. He's focused his work on trying to get local governments and police departments to stop using criminal and municipal laws to punish behavior related to drug use, and has worked on Pivot's application for an injunction which allowed the Crosstown Clinic to continue its heroin-assisted therapy programming. So Doug's going to fill in another piece of the puzzle.
Thank you, Douglas. Well, good evening, everybody. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I think this is probably one of the most important topics that exists in our society at large, and specifically here in the Downtown Eastside in Vancouver. So as Donald said, my name is Doug King. I am a lawyer for the Pivot Legal Society and litigation director, and I was one of the lucky people, I guess, to have the opportunity to work on a constitutional challenge to fight the federal government, former federal government Conservative Party, in their actions to try to shut down the Crosstown Clinic and the continued heroin-assisted treatment program. In that regard, I wanted to make note, I guess, that I am one of a legal team that worked on the project that I want to talk to you about. Specifically, I want to point out the lawyers Joe Arve, Allison Latimer, Angela Juba, Scott Bernstein, and Adrian Smith, We're all very active participants and did a lot of effort in engaging in the kind of litigation, and probably most importantly, our clients that we represented, individuals who were part of the SALOME project, part of the SNAP Patients Association, and who really were the ones that pushed from the very beginning for a long-term continued heroin-assisted treatment program after the clinical trial was done. If it weren't for their continued advocacy, then none of us would be talking here tonight. So I want to fill in a little bit of the story on that very last point that Susan talked about, which is the movement from the SALOME clinical trial to what we now currently have in Vancouver, which is a permanent, hopefully, program where people are able to receive heroin in a clinical model through the Crosstown Clinic. And there was a transition that occurred, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the legal challenge of the case around the ideological fight that we had with the federal government, which prevented that from happening. So in 2013, when the SALOME project was ending, the clinical trials were ending, the doctors at Crosstown Clinic submitted what's called SAPs to the federal government, and that's a special access program. This program is designed to allow physicians to have special access to a drug that's not normally available. Not surprisingly, because of the history of prohibition, heroin was not a drug that was normally available. The exact same day that the doctors made applications which were actually approved by Health Canada to the special access program, the federal conservative government stepped in to shut down the operation. And what they did was they introduced what's called legal regulations, and these regulations effectively said that no doctor will ever have access to heroin under the special access program. It was kind of a gut-wrenching moment, I guess, to get to the point where we were able to, continually advocate for a permanent heroin-assisted treatment program, to have Providence Health step in to make that a possibility, make it a reality, only to have the federal government at the last moment step in and say, on ideological grounds, essentially, we're not going to let this happen. So immediately, we formed, I guess, the best alliance that we could to try to fight this, and we brought what's called a constitutional challenge in the BC Supreme Court to overturn those federal regulations and to open up the ability for patients to access heroin-assisted treatment once again. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that case. I'm going to try to make it as interesting as possible, understanding that constitutional legal questions are not exactly the most thrilling topic of the evening. But there are some very, very important and interesting aspects of the case, because at the heart of it, this case was about, a clinical model, a scientifically backed, evidence-based procedure and treatment option up against what really has been an ideological fight in our country and many countries like it for the last 50 or 60 years. And there's probably nothing more telling than the federal government's statement when they introduced these regulations. Well, they ultimately went into court and argued that it was for the purposes of public safety, which is pretty much always the justification for drug laws in countries like Canada. In their actual media statement, the federal government and the health minister, Rona Ambrose, actually stated that their purpose was to take heroin out of people's hands to make sure that it wouldn't be put into their arms. And it was all about that idea of prohibition and the moral fiber argument that's continually battled with the conservative government. So what we did when we started our constitutional challenge is we brought together, I think, a very, very important alliance, which up to this point hadn't necessarily existed in this form. And the alliance was that the Providence Health Care, the actual clinical, medical setting, teamed up with the patients themselves. We represented 5 SALOME participants who wanted to continually access their treatment. And we joined up together. We represented the patients. Providence represented, obviously, their program itself. And as a team, we argued that the federal government was unconstitutionally bringing these regulations. And we did so on 3 separate grounds. The first was that by introducing these regulations, the federal government was putting the security of our patient's person at risk. And this is Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. It's the charter right that ensures that the government should not take away our right to life, liberty, and security of the person. It's probably the most important and sacred charter right that we have. We also argued that what the federal government really was doing was trying to regulate healthcare, and that they didn't have the authority to regulate healthcare, and that because of that, they were outside of their boundaries. And we also made an argument that under Section 15 of the Charter, they were discriminating against our clients because the only reason they were treating them this way is because they were addicted to a substance, which obviously in the medical world is seen as a disability, and a disability is something that's protected under the Charter. So one of the common misconceptions, I guess, that exists in the law is that you can't just stroll into the courtroom and ask for an injunction. You actually have to start a lawsuit first, and then through the lawsuit make an application for an injunction. So one of the toughest parts about this case was actually building the foundation for a lawsuit that would endure not just through the injunction stage, but ultimately something that we could argue 2 or 3 years down the line and try to get a final judgment to say that the government was clearly unconstitutional. And while we were waiting for that lawsuit to occur, we filed an application for that injunction, and we were able to have that injunction heard in March. Now, the funny thing about a case like this is in the legal community, all of this happened in about 6 months' time. The lawsuit was filed in November of 2013. We were able to receive an injunction against the federal government, which effectively stopped those regulations in March of 2014. In the legal world, 6 months turnaround on an injunction is actually pretty quick. It took a lot of effort, quick resourcing, obviously, and as you'll hear later on tonight, for the patients who are actually involved, 6 months is essentially an eternity. So it's a reminder, I guess, for us in the legal profession that as much as we can fight for these kind of rights for people, the rights in the courtroom can have an incredible toll in just how long it takes to actualize those rights and how to realize those rights. So in our injunction application, we most of all were fighting for the concept that these regulations were going to cause our clients irreparable harm. It's one of the tests for obtaining an injunction. And one thing that you have to remember is at the time, in 2013, the crisis that currently exists in Vancouver was barely being talked about. In fact, it was only really starting to scratch the surface in the mainstream media. You started hearing stories about people overdosing. You started hearing kind of rumblings of something different that was happening. But at that time, it was not even closely widely accepted that we had a crisis about to occur on our streets. And that made it incredibly difficult to convince a judge that by taking away our clients' access to heroin-assisted treatment, that they were going to suffer irreparable harm. You know, in retrospect, looking back, it seems like an incredibly obvious argument to make. You had a group of people who had access to a clean drug supply in a clinical setting. Once they lost that, they would go back to using on the streets, and everybody knows now just how dangerous that is. But at the time, it took some very, very brave, some very, very detailed testimony from our clients to convince the judge. And, you know, for lawyers, we can argue the law, but they often say in law school that cases are won on the facts, and you have to have strong facts to win those cases. Well, our facts came from our clients, from the participants in SALOME, and for the individuals who have operated in SNAP. And they really were able to clearly tell the judge just specifically what kind of a harm taking away heroin-assisted treatment would have. So one of the things that we're going to talk about tonight is, you know, what happens now? What happens in the future? Well, after the injunction was given, we had to continually fight the litigation, and we actually assumed that last year we would be going to trial and fighting the federal government on this issue in the hopes that we would get a strong judgment that said specifically that the government could not do this. What happened in between the injunction and the date set for trial was a change in government. And while there's certainly lots of criticism that could be leveled on our current government, one thing that they did was remove the regulations that were brought in by the Conservative government and openly allowed for the continued use of heroin-assisted treatment in Vancouver. So by removing those regulations, they effectively ended the lawsuit, ended the constitutional challenge, and brought us back to the system that we had before. And I'm sure Dr. MacDonald is going to give you much more detail about how Crosstown currently operates and some of the difficulties that it continues to have inside the current regulatory system. But we were ultimately successful in obtaining the continued access to heroin treatment for our clients. In terms of where we go now, you know, our office continues to say that the fight is not over. As much as Crosstown exists, we're continually left with this question of why there is only one Crosstown, and why is it only in one health authority? We're met primarily with silence from the other health authorities for why they haven't replicated the Crosstown model. And we still have concerns that if another organization, if another health authority, or even just an individual doctor tried to do what Crosstown has done and make an application to the federal government, there's no assurance that they wouldn't be shut down, that the federal government wouldn't deny that application. And then again, you know, as a legal organization, we would be called in to step in and try to fight that. So certainly we have a lot of different kind of battles in the future that we anticipate we'll probably have to fight. And ultimately, you know, it's going to come down, I think, to the medical community to continually push for the rights of their patients and to continually have to show the government why they're so necessary. So on that note, I wanted to turn it over to Dr. MacDonald, who has, probably the greatest knowledge in this area and can tell you all about Crosstown Clinic and how important it is.
Thank you, Doug. Thanks, Doug, for that. And I just want to remind everybody that we're in the context of a public health emergency. And I think one of the things that our organization is constantly trying to say, Doug mentioned 6 months being fast in the legal community. And yeah, that's right. 6 minutes is a long time if you're experiencing an overdose. And in the 90s, we had the same thing. And we had a public health emergency declared in 1997. 6 years later, Insight opened its doors. 5 years later, Dr. Peter Center opened its doors. So it took that long for a community to mobilize, politicians to mobilize, and I mean, it's mind-numbingly slow, this change. So we're always asking the question, and I'll pose it to Donald Scott MacDonald, before he even gets up, is, if you're in a public health emergency, surely to God you do things differently. You don't follow the same rules. You expedite things, you cut corners, and then you pull back when the emergency is over. So, and I've watched Scott MacDonald, I don't know, you've had a few media appearances over the last couple of years, and he's been a fabulous physician activist lead at the Providence Crosstown Clinic. And it seems sometimes it's a voice in the wilderness. It's sort of, you can only lay out the evidence so many times and put it in front of people, and why don't things change? And so I think we have some materials for you, which we will hand out later, to help us make things change. So Scott is the physician lead at the Providence Crosstown Clinic, which was the site of the NAOMI and SALOME clinical trials. He continues to supervise injectable opioid assisted substitution treatment at the clinic. Dr. MacDonald and his team are the first physicians in the world to prescribe hydromorphone for the treatment of substance use disorder. Crosstown is still the only clinic in North America to provide injectable diacetylmorphine or prescription heroin. So it's a real pleasure to have you here, Scott, to tell us about the work you do.
The last time I was in this room, Vancouver Coastal Health was announcing their second generation strategy for the Downtown Eastside, and that included medicalization of opioids. And I stood up and said, yes, great. Prescription heroin is possible. And that was before the current opioid crisis. It is still possible. And every single opioid overdose death is a preventable death.
I met him at the injection site and he was heroin sick. And I actually had some and I took him and helped him. And back then we were struggling. Your life just turns into all it's about is getting well. Every minute of every day, you're either making money to get well or getting well. And I tried treatments, I tried everything, and nothing would work. And you lose yourself. And the difference from then to today is we have our lives back.
Here at the Crosstown Clinic, we provide injectable treatment options for the most severely affected heroin users who have not responded to the typical treatments. But suffering from injection use of illicit heroin is enormous. The individuals suffer and society suffers as well. If people are not engaged in care with methadone and Suboxone, which are great treatments and work for most people, we need more treatment options, more tools in the toolkit. Not only is this treatment more effective than the standard treatments, it is also more cost effective.
It just brought me back, in touch with feeling like there was a way out, a way to get healthy again and a way to feel human.
I hated myself many, many years. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see me. I saw a person that did her hair. I didn't look at me. I just used the mirror to beautify myself to make some money for more drugs. Now I look at me, who I am, and I can smile, because I like me today. I find myself to make some money. I find myself to make some money from more drugs. Now I look at me, who I am.
How do I get out of here? Okay. Thank you. And thank you to our patients who were willing to speak out both in this video and tonight. Their words are much more powerful than anything I could say. Again, thank you to our study participants. Thank you to our research team, in particular, Eugenia Vediokis, who was principal investigator both in NAOMI and in SALOME. Opioid use disorder for us is a chronic relapsing disease, and substitution with oral treatments work, but not for everybody. There's a small number of folks who are not attracted into care with those. Heroin-assisted treatment is what they need. And it's time, particularly in the context of this opioid crisis, for this treatment approach to expand here in Vancouver, here in British Columbia, and across the country for everybody who needs it. So this is a summary of the Cochrane database review, a meta-analysis of the existing studies in support of heroin-assisted treatment. Over 2,000 patients have been involved in these studies. All studies showed that there's benefit of heroin, and because of adverse events, we recommend a supervised approach. Benefits include retention in care, reduction in street drug use, illicit activities, and mortality. This is a life-saving treatment. In our model of care, which is a supervised model, the treatments are self-injected under supervision by medical staff. This ensures safety of the patients and also the community. In our SALOME study, there were over 88,000 injections in a 6-month period. Our nurses only had to intervene with oxygen and Narcan 14 times. And all of those overdoses were safely managed on-site at Crosstown. That speaks to the safety and effectiveness of a pharmaceutical-grade intervention like this. And for some folks, having access to this treatment is a motivation to attend care and gives us an option to offer comprehensive care. Who would it be appropriate for this treatment? Well, the SALOME study, we selected people who met the diagnostic criteria for opioid dependence, 19 years of age, at least 5 years of opioid use, regular use in the past year, at least 2 episodes of treatment, one of which had to be substitution treatment, such as methadone, and also poor physical, psychological, mental, or psychological functioning. That was our intake criteria. We recruited folks who had tried treatment at least 11 times and who had been using for 15 years on average. So if this is the criteria, we may be setting the bar too high. This is a graph from SALOME data on its time 0, 3, and 6 months, and the number of days of illicit opioid use. And you can see at the start of the study, people were using every day, and by 6 months, they're down to using just a handful of days a month. That's how it works.
How many quit completely?
Abstinence is not the goal of our treatment, but some people have gotten there, a small number, and we've only been in operation for a year or two. With time, those numbers will increase. And this is our retention data, and at 6 months, over 80% of our patients are still retained in care. That is remarkable for any medical intervention. and particularly this challenging to engage group that has not been engaged in any other treatment. This is some of the diacetylmorphine and prescription heroin dosing in SALOME here in Canada, NAOMI, Germany, Spain, Geneva, some other places that offer, and the dosages are basically similar across the board. So SALOME studied is hydromorphone or Dilaudid as good as diacetylmorphine or prescription heroin. The advantage to hydromorphone is it's available now and is a pharmacare benefit. And we were able to show, yes, it is as good as, but we need both treatments. The other thing is this is actually a cost-saving intervention. Not only is diacetylmorphine or injectable treatments, including hydromorphone, more effective than methadone in that population that continues to use illicit opioids, it is also more cost-effective. And when a new treatment meets both of those criteria, more effective and cost-saving, it should be offered. And this data was available and published for hydromorphone. The diacetylmorphine data has been available for a quarter of a century. In April of 2016. That was a month after the health emergency had already been declared. And now we're coming into a year since this information has been available. So we estimate that the cost to society for somebody who's using illicit opioids is about $45,000 a year, and that's probably an underestimate. That's at least. It's probably more than that, and that's just societal costs. We don't include the costs of stolen property or damage to property. So that's a very, very conservative estimate. It costs us about $27,000 per patient at Crosstown, but that's with the SAP and all the regulatory hurdles and security requirements. With some efficiencies built in, we think we could get that cost down to $15,000. But it's not about cost. This is cost effective. If this is offered to that small number of people who need it, societal costs are reduced. And nothing but injectables will work for a small group of people. And if we just keep slogging what we're doing now, it's not efficient. And an ineffective service is inefficient, and it cannot be cost-effective no matter how cheaply it is provided. Sort of the guru of evidence-based medicine, Cochrane, said that back in 1972, and that still applies today. So we're calling this supervised injectable opioid. We're going to change it to agonist treatment now. That's sort of a medical term for an opioid analog, and I've just had this thought today in consultation with some other folks, and it sounds more medical. And this needs to be a medical intervention that is just part of the continuum of care. And the assisted word sort of specializes it and makes it kind of cute, but it is just another medical intervention. So I will change the slide the next time it's in. I am an optimist. And that's one of the reasons that we persisted with the SAP applications going through the SALOME study, because this is an evidence-based treatment. And we never thought that this was impossible. We always thought this was possible, and our patients deserve the care that they need, particularly in the context of being participants in a study. It's just the ethical and moral thing to do. So September 20th, 2013 was a good day for us. We had, our fax machine went wild with SAP approvals. And that very same afternoon, the former Minister of Health said this, I won't repeat it here. But our Minister Minister of Health here in British Columbia stood up the same day, and healthcare is a provincial responsibility. And he said, we are reluctant to close the door on innovation and creativity when it comes to tackling these very challenging problems. And then we had our lawsuit, and we received a court injunction in May of 2014. The first person started treatment. Took us about almost 6 months to get the first delivery. So that's added on to this, the 6 months of suffering. But in November 28th of 2014, the first person started prescription heroin treatment here in Vancouver, and it continues to this day. But things have changed. We've moved forward. This happened back in June of 2016. I was invited to testify before the United States Senate Homeland Security Committee about our experience here in Vancouver. The hearing was titled The United States' Insatiable Demand for Drugs, Exploring New Treatment Approaches. Prescription heroin will be available, but it still faces regulatory obstacles. We can only attain it now through the Special Access Program. Every single application they will only provide 6 months at a time. We need to have it shipped from Switzerland. It's a very complicated import arrangement, and Canada doesn't even have a direct import agreement with Switzerland, so we need to go through the EU, and an import and export permit is required every step along the way. But what we need is for this to be licensed and produced in Canada. Back in November, on a Saturday morning, Minister Philpott tweeted that our government has done the work to make it available, and now we need other partners to step up, which basically is somebody needs to produce this and make an application in Canada and make an application for a drug identification number. I think it will happen. But in the meantime, people are dying on the streets of Vancouver, and hydromorphone is a licensed available product. We have identified at least 500 people in the course of our recruitment that would have benefited from a treatment like this. And I was happy to hear our mayor of Vancouver calling for expansion of supervised injectable opioid agonist treatment clinics urgently here in Vancouver. And this is urgent. This happened in January. There was a coroner's inquest into the death of Brandon Jansen at a treatment facility last year. But the scope of that hearing was expanded to include the broader response to the opioid crisis. And I want to draw your attention of the 21 recommendations that jury made. Number 12 was to the CEOs of the regional health authorities in British Columbia, expand diacetylmorphine and hydromorphone treatment programs for chronic opioid users. So just to sum up, this is injectable treatment, an intensified treatment option for those who continue to use illicit opioids. And that is very risky. It includes injection-related infections, overdose, the risk of irreparable harm and death. This treatment reduces people's need for street drugs, reduces crime, and leads to more engagement with healthcare and addictions services. And it's safe, it's effective, it's cost-saving. It should be offered to that small number of people who need a life-saving treatment like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, for illuminating the program and the dilemmas before the program, the dilemmas we have in expanding the program. Now we're going to hear from some of the NAOMI SNAP, S-N-A-P, SALOME, NAOMI, Association of Patients. I always get it reversed. And Dave Murray's going to sit up here and or stand up here, whatever. You're okay? Thank you. Sorry? Ora and Greg are going to come up. They're coming up. Here they are to join Dave. Dave is the founder of SNAP, and for over 6 years he has facilitated SNAP's weekly meetings. He's also a volunteer at the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users and a board member of the Downtown Eastside Neighborhood Council and Pivot Legal Society. And Ora has worked at Insight for 5 years, currently as a casual supervisor. Ora is also a longtime member of SNAP and a resident of the Downtown Eastside. Welcome, Ora.
I'm just here to do the slideshow.
And Greg Frez. Greg is SNAP's liaison to Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users on the Bandu board, and he is a longtime member of SNAP and a resident of the Downtown Eastside. Thank you, Greg.
I'm a little hurt here, so I was about to pass out before he started, but anyway, I'll make it through. They treat pain differently. Okay, so we formed a group that originally it was formed with the urging of Pivot and some people in the community and Livingston for Group 1 in particular. To organize around the NAOMI patients. You know, the NAOMI patients went through the trial, and at the end of the trial, they were just offered, you know, the conventional treatment, which was which was methadone, excuse me. And it just didn't, and that had been the requirement for participating in the study, was that you had to have failed at methadone 3 or 4 times to get into the trial. And it was just the government wouldn't say yes to this SAP applications. They had never been used to access diacetylmorphine ever. So I know Scott MacDonald tried to do it, but they just refused them, and there was nowhere else to go. So originally it was around, we thought maybe the NAOMI patients might have had a legal position to take. As it turned out, we had waited a little too long, so it didn't work out that way. Anyway, then up came the next study, which was SALOME. So many of the people that we had organized wanted to participate in the next study, but we made a little vow, kind of, among the patients, was that we're not going to let that happen again. No matter what, we were going to lie down in front of buses or whatever it was going to take, that we weren't going to let it end at the end of a 6 months or a 1-year trial. That because we had read Canada's position around the world, in Africa, everywhere. You don't have clinical trial studies with drugs, and if the drug works, then you have to offer the drug to the people in the trials, you know, until they don't need it anymore. And this is the way we treat people in other countries. We certainly could have treated our own people the same way, and we didn't. Shame on Canada, you know? But we weren't going to let that happen with SALOME. So we had to organize the patients, which is, you know, the way it's done in British Columbia. Yeah, you have to organize to get anywhere. Some people know that's true. Okay. So anyway, I'm going to quickly read you our mission statement. So SNAP mission statement was, SNAP is a unique group of people who were participants in NAOMI and or SALOME Heroin Assisted Therapy clinical trials in Vancouver, BC. We are an independent group dedicated to supporting each other, educating peers, researchers, government, and the public. You guys. And we advocate for the human rights of people who use opiates, the establishment of permanent and less medicalized PAP programs in Canada, and an end to drug prohibition.
Yeah.
Here, here. So we thought we were pretty well experts on all of this by now, and so the advocacy we went to every meeting they had. You know, anytime they had a meeting, we were there. You know, and we wanted to let them know that we were in the room, and that we weren't going to let just, you know, if we had to go to ethic boards or whatever, we weren't going to let it just fly right by and not have any plan for the end of the SALOME study. As it turned out, the government was receptive. Well, Health Canada, let's put it this way, was receptive to certain applications for heroin assisted treatment. We had the option here at the SALOME was that there was another drug involved, which was hydromorphone, which is the Dilaudid. It's known as Dilaudid on the street and in the pharmacies, and it's a synthetic opiate that it mimics a lot of the things that diacetylmorphine has. You know, people who are addicts, street addicts, it can duplicate diacetylmorphine, and for a lot of people, not everyone, but for a lot, or it can last for a while. It can be a good substitute, and so we were determined that by the end of this thing, we were all going to get something. So we made these applications. Doctors who are great at our clinic, Dr. MacDonald, of course, and there's another doctor there, I have to say her name right here, Cheryl McDermott, who's Dr. MacDonald's partner over there. And they've just like spent days and nights writing these applications to Health Canada, and on the phone to Health Canada, and meeting all kinds of resistance at different times, and jumping through so many hoops, you know. It was just amazing what they had to do. They had to answer questions that didn't make any sense, and you know, it's government. You know, they were dealing with people in the government, which was kind of. So part of like I've been involved in this community for a number of years, Downtown Eastside. So we've had some. We were talking before about Bud Osborne, a great poet, and there was another great poet who died recently in our neighborhood. And he wrote a poem that kind of influenced us in a lot of ways. And the poem goes something it goes like this: telling stories. We need to tell our own stories. If we don't tell our stories, people with power will tell our stories for us. And we won't like what they say. We tell our stories, we reach out to each other and build community. And that's what we kind of looked at as a guiding principle among our group. And so and then now we get a little further on, we come to a court case. So we go to court because Rona Ambrose decides that no matter what our officials in Health Canada say, the evidence is not there. She's just going to cut us all off and let us all go back to the street. So what do? Doug King and all the lawyers from Pivot, who were all dedicated to this cause, and others, and we went to court. There were five of us, I was included in that, and we went to court to claim to the government that this was wrong. This is not the way to treat the evidence. I mean, it was a part of the Harper government's continuing theme where they were not listening to scientific evidence. Scientific evidence, it didn't mean anything to that government. What they felt morally or religiously or whatever it was, I don't know what it was. That's what mattered to them. But the evidence meant nothing. You know, you could be, the science was there, we showed them it was there, and they decided we had to go to court. That was the only way that we could halt them. So we got a good judge, you know, the Chief Justice for the Province of British Columbia in that court, and Judge Hinkson, and he just said no. He gave us a temporary injunction and told her that they had to go back to the original rules. You know, she was going to cut off every kind of research on any kind of drug in Canada with her signature. You know, any kind of studies that were going on with any kind of drug, LSD or any kind of drugs that were MDMA that they were testing for depression and PTSD and all that. She was cutting off all scientific study in Canada on any kind of drug. And so, I mean, this was part of what couldn't be, we couldn't let this happen. Nobody could let this happen. So anyway, the judge ruled temporarily that no, she couldn't do it. We had a trial scheduled when somebody talked about time, how long time takes. 2 years into the future. 2 years. So I mean, like, here we're gonna go 2 years just waiting for this trial to come up. And meantime, of course, everybody knows what happened. They voted out Harper, and brought in Trudeau. The whole atmosphere in Ottawa changed. And it rippled down into the Health Canada too. And everything started to get approved. All the applications that were being done for the 140 souls that were at the clinic were getting approved, you know, which was a good thing. And it was a change in government, and they started to listen to the evidence. The evidence is there, you know, it's been proven all over the world. I mean, it started in Switzerland in 1993, where they just went out there and signed up everybody to this study. Everybody. They ended up signing up 1,500 people. You know, anywhere they saw somebody shooting up, they said, "Hey, come on in. We'll give you some." You know, and they started them in the program, and they did it. Hey, and the Swiss are pretty smart people, very conservative people. The Swiss people. You know, I mean, and so every now and then they do referendums in Switzerland. They have a referendum to see, you know, like they throw referendums on the ballot when they do their elections. We don't do that here, but in Switzerland they do that. So they asked the people, "Can we include heroin assisted treatment in the health program, in a permanent program?" And you know what? The people voted like 60-40 for it. It was like 58-48 or whatever. I'm not really sure the exact. 60-40, they voted for it to include it in the healthcare system as a program. Wow. About a year later, they threw another thing on the referendum. Do you want to legalize marijuana for a recreational drug? They voted 60-40 against it. But you know what? That sounds funny, but it's not. They recognize the difference. They recognize that this was a medical intervention, the heroin-assisted treatment, and the marijuana was just like another drug. It was like another adding the booze, you know, like pot and booze and all the rest of it. And they were trying to protect the young people, and they knew that by doing this heroin-assisted treatment in a clinic, they were protecting the young people from it. You know, there was a lot less drug dealing going on because these 1,500 people were already consumed in a clinic. So they weren't out there selling drugs anymore. You know, because a lot of people sell drugs to support their habit. And so therefore, young people are starting to use drugs. It's just the way it is. Anyway, that we avoided that. Am I still on? Yeah, so I talked a little bit about the activism around drug policy. Okay, so anyway, we're activists, and that's it. We're not going to let them take this away from us, and I think that it would benefit so many people. You know, there's so many people that my friends that have died in the last year. It's just really sickening. Everybody here in this thing will tell you that, and I'm sure so many people out there knew some of these people in the past. And it's so heart-wrenching because it's like, you know, Dr. MacDonald was right. He's got the cure for it. I mean, it's not going to work for everybody. Don't think that people are just going to start lining up and be getting, you know, free drugs. It's not going to work like that at all. It's going to work for the people who really need it. Many people are going to function very well on Suboxone. People are going to suffer very well on methadone. Other people are going to do well on morphine. It's like different strokes for different folks. It really is, because we're all different. And we all have different reasons for getting to where we were, you know, getting this dependency on the opiate dependency. We didn't just arrive all on the same ship. We got here on different little boats. And so anyway, thanks for coming back.
Hi, everybody. I'm Greg Frez. I'm a Saskatchewan farm boy. Real naive one I was for quite a while. They asked me to tell a little bit of my story, so I will. I came out here when I was 19 years old playing junior A hockey for the New Westminster Bruins. They used to be called the Estevan Bruins, and that's where I'm from, the Bible Belt, Estevan. You know, like stealing a car wasn't even heard of back there in them days, around where I grew up, eh? a farm boy, you know, we went to church twice a week and all that, eh? Well, when I was playing for the Bruins, I was out partying with my friends, and we got drunk one night, and I went through the windshield at 90 mile an hour. And you can imagine the injuries I got. One of my friends got killed that was in the car with us, and I still got pain and suffering from those injuries. So here's how I got wired to dope. I got morphine from the doctors, and then once they kicked me out after 2 weeks in the hospital, I had nothing. So I came downtown Vancouver, and I ran in with the crowd that had heroin, and it took my pain away. And then I realized you got to deal it to be able to pay for it. You got to steal, you got to do this, you got to do that. Well, I hadn't stolen anything in my life, so I ended up doing 20 years in jail for stealing. I was the worst thief in the world. You know what I mean? I did 20 years in the pens since, because of my addictions. And it just wasn't working. And then I ran into a guy named Scott MacDonald. And he was my doctor before he was in the clinic there, and he's a godsend, believe me. We should all say a prayer for this man, because he's basically turned my life around. And he got me going on this, and I wasn't allowed to go to the NAOMI. I tried, but I had outstanding charges, stealing to support my habit. And I couldn't get in the NAOMI program, but they changed the what do you call it, the criteria. They changed the criteria to get into the SALOME, thank God, and I got into it. And my life has changed 100%. I got my own place. I got my own friends that talk to me now. They don't look at me with their nose up in the air. You know what I mean? Like, they don't think, oh, there's that thief, there's that junkie. You know what I mean? Like, it's an embarrassing thing to have to admit to, but we'll do anything we can. When you got serious pain and you got serious problems, you don't care what you do. You just go out and do it. Whatever. That's human nature. You go out and you do it. You know. And that's what I did, and I paid for it. And thank God for the programs that are coming into effect now. Dave brought up that they're saying that all these people died within these last couple, 3-4 years. Well, they've died, but they're not doing anything about it. You know, everything's so slow. I've got about 150 people ask me about the SALOME project. How can we get in? Please, make sure you get me in. If you can get me in on the list, get me on that list. And this is every day I got friends asking me this. So this is a program, this has to be brought, elevated. Heroin Assisted Treatment was a savior for me. Anyways, thanks.
Hi everybody, I'm Maura, and I have a similar story to Dave and Greg. I got into the program in 2013, and since then I've held down a job for 5 years. I got back in touch with my family. There's no more crime in my life, no more chasing drugs. I haven't purchased heroin since I got into the program, and I can honestly say, even before I was really into the heroin, I could never really hold down a job. Like, I was just thinking about that tonight, like, you know. So I mean, this program is same thing what he said. You know, I get asked all the time by people who are addicted to get them into the program. And before I was in the program, I ran into one of the participants in the street. I couldn't believe how much he had changed. Like, I asked him, I said, "You got a job? Are you going to a job interview? You know, you look great." And he said to me, he says, "Oh, I'm in the SALOME program." And I said, "Well, can you get me in?" And that same day, I went down to the clinic, and next thing I know, my name was on the list. And yeah, I mean, the rest is history. But I don't really have much other than to say than we should all be supporting this program, because it's a win-win situation for everybody. No, not just the clients, not the patients. It's everybody, the community, doctors, nurses, students, children. You know, it gives hope, right? Thank you.
We're going to take questions. You can be the first one, okay? But wait till people get up here. We're going to have questions, and thank you so much for all the presentations. Where is Doug? Doug's going to come up, and Susan is already up, and who else is missing? Oh, Dave. And Scott. Donald Scott MacDonald. Where is he? Oh, he's behind me. I was trying to figure out why I wasn't using the word Donald, but I guess when you have Donald in your last name, you don't really want Donald in your first name. So, is that the reason? I got the first question. It's about Scott's name. Sorry.
Well, my father was Donald, so it was just confusing.
Too many Donalds. Okay. So we have some time for, I think we have about 20, 30 minutes for questions. And I certainly know these guys opened up a lot of territory. Remember, we are in the context of a public health emergency.
Yes.
And you've heard the word slow a bunch of times tonight, and not fast enough, and people are dying, etc., etc., etc. We have a young man in a wonderful hat in the front row who is...
Sam's back in there.
Anne is going to carry the microphones around.
Well, I'm James Spackenwet. I'm a little disappointed here tonight because I didn't come to here to learn what I was hoping to learn. First question was, I would like you to clarify, sir, would you clarify what you meant by pain? When you said pain, that you needed heroin for pain.
Yes.
How much of that pain was physical pain from damage? How much of it was emotional pain? How much of it was pain from withdrawal? Would you clarify that for the people?
I'd say physical pain was like 60%. Pain mentally was, can you hear me? Mental pain was 30%, and the other 10% was just, you know, the embarrassment to be out there amongst my parents and teachers. And like I had 3 years university at the time too. Everybody thought I was the honor kid, you know what I mean? I was the good boy in the family. I'm from a family of 7 boys and 2 girls. And my mom was a school teacher. So imagine how my mother felt when I was the first boy, right in the middle, the 4th boy, to be doing heroin, you know, to be wired to heroin. And, you know, my poor mother, you know, she became principal of the school. And I could imagine her in Estevan, Saskatchewan, telling everybody, that's my junkie son. You know, imagine what she went through. You know,
10% was pain from withdrawal?
Yes, and about 10% was withdrawal pain, because I'd do anything to get, I tried methadone 8 times. I tried everything, morphine, and morphine is just a money grab, because the more morphine you get, the more you gotta have, you know. And with heroin, I find, I'm on heroin assisted right now, and I find that with the heroin treatment, I can do a certain amount, and it works for me. You know, like where we are right now at the clinic, they give you a certain amount there. Everybody is, you know, not the same. So what they do is they work you up to where what your body can take and what you can take. You know, not so that you're just like that, right? They do what you.
There's no psychotherapy that goes along with it?
Oh sure, there's workers there. They got everything there. They got psychologists. They got everything there. It's a complete 100% around for you, for the patient, and that's what saves us.
Okay, fabulous. We have a question right here. And the shorter and more concise your questions are means we can get more questions in.
I hate microphones. Scott, I listened to you today on CBC and you said you need a room and a nurse. So that sounds very simple. What's the next step with that? Sorry, I'm paraphrasing you.
Well, I agree. It really is
I'm
as
a nurse,
simple.
by the way, so you have the nurse.
Yeah, we have a room.
The room, it is just a simple room. All you need is a place you can provide the treatment, and someplace where you can store the hydromorphone. And our nurses and our medical staff are valuable. And they, like anybody who works, deserves to be compensated for that work. So the obstacle at this point, in my opinion, is only funding and the will to provide that.
Thank you. We have a question back here and then one behind there.
Okay.
Yep, you're on.
Okay. I don't know. I keep hearing national crisis, national crisis. I moved here last October from Burnaby Heights because of this national crisis was killing all of my friends. I'm on disability. I have to pay for an oximeter. That's my new fashion statement, by the way. The jewelry I can't leave home without now. Why is policy still more important than human life? Like, why can't we just do what needs to be done without regard to policy and the federal government? People are dying here.
Thank you for that passionate plea. Does anyone want to comment on that, or is it?
We all agree with you.
We certainly do. There's a lot of agreement in the room, ma'am.
We all agree with you, and I think Dr. Scott MacDonald talked to some of the obstacles that need to be ironed out, and one of the major ones is that we don't have a DIN number for heroin and a producer and distributor of heroin in Canada. Some producer needs to step up and apply to produce heroin here. That would make it a lot easier, but of course we need some federal action, and we have a sheet that we're going to distribute to everyone to put pressure on Providence Health, put pressure on your health authorities, put pressure on our premier especially, but at the federal level as well, so that we could see more action.
Thank you. We have one back here.
How come it takes so long for partners to get into the program?
Could you repeat the question?
How come partners get, how long does it take to get partners into the program?
It means like couples. Like there's one person in the program and they have a spouse that's also an addict that needs to get into the program. He wants to know how long.
Well, I think the first step is this needs to be a program. A program within healthcare in British Columbia and part of the continuum of care for severe opioid use disorder and people who have to use injectable opioids. When that happens, this is not a large number of people. It is possible with our in this city with the evidence that we currently have to treat everybody in British Columbia who would need this treatment.
Over here? Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, hi. Donald, right? I spoke to you earlier today. I'm Ed.
Ed. Hi, Ed.
We talked. And they say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but believe it, I learned something tonight. Okay, full disclosure. Way back in the mid-70s, I was one of the pioneers in drug treatment in this province. And we had people like Bert Hoskin, maybe some of you know him or didn't know him. He was going to corral all of the heroin addicts on an island. That was his solution, provincial government. Anyway, now we've come to this point in 2017. So I did learn a lot, and I have to thank Dr. MacDonald that I did learn quite a bit. You made a convert out of me because I believe in not necessarily abstinence, but a more cognitive behavioral approach. But I can see the case has been made, for me anyway. Anyway, my question is really for Dr. Boyd. In your outline, you mentioned about the situation here in BC with colonization, etc., etc. And I think you mentioned also about Scandinavia and Europe and their drug experiences. So I remain with this curiosity about why people use drugs in the first place. And I just wondered if you had any comparative information about what happens in, say, another big area like Europe, like Asia, for instance. Do they resort to drugs as people do in the West? That's my question, if you have that information.
I guess what I would say is that the reasons that people use both either legal or illegal drugs is very diverse, and that we know that drugs don't stay in the category. You know, for instance, cannabis was legal until 1923, and then it was illegal, and now the Liberal government is going to push forward legislation to legalize it. So it's not really about the drug, usually. There's no real good or bad drug per se. What you could say is that as a society, we, in certain decades, attach certain meaning to a drug, like they did in the early 1900s. It was the smoking of opium that moral reformers were upset about. They saw that as different than taking like liquid laudanum or opiate-based liquid drugs. And that was linked to, you know, legal and social discrimination against Chinese people who lived in British Columbia, but especially in the mainland here. When you look across the world, I think the different countries have approached drugs differently. You know, some countries like the United States, Switzerland, actually, Sweden, very prohibitionist country, sort of the seat of alcohol temperance. You know, so each country is quite different in their attitudes about drugs, but they're not static. And I think that's the thing that we should be very hopeful about, is that laws are not static, policies are not static. And what I mean by that is that they change. You know, for all the women who are in the audience, you know, at one point you couldn't vote for First Nations people in Canada. They couldn't vote, you know, as a status Indian until the 1950s. You know, the same for Chinese residents and South Asian residents. They were disenfranchised in British Columbia in the early 1900s. You know, things do change, even though we still have a lot of discrimination, legal and social discrimination, especially against people who use criminalized drugs. So I don't think there's one answer to why people use drugs, why people become dependent. I think it's quite diverse. There's
the Asian culture was a huge.
Well, there wasn't, at the time that the smoking of opium and opium-based drugs for non-medical purposes were criminalized here in Canada, there wasn't an epidemic of opiate addiction or smoking opium at all. There's no evidence when you look back at the documents related to that. It was basically linked to racialized fears about Chinese people living in BC, a little bit attached to the idea that they were taking white laborers' jobs. You have to remember, Canada was considered to be white Canada. It was British Columbia. British meant white. At that riot in 1907, you know, it was a demonstration first, and then people went off and rioted. There were banners at the demonstration saying white Canada, white BC. This was normalized at that time. So I think you have to try to think about the context of how those laws emerged. But unfortunately, when we set forward on that path, we really didn't critique it for decades. And it's a failed policy that harms a lot of people. And we see that across the world. You know, that prohibitionist, punitive policy actually increases incarceration, that it increases our rates of HIV/AIDS, overdose deaths, that it really is a detriment to society and well-being. It breaks apart families and communities.
Thank you for the question and the answer. Right here in the front row.
I guess this question goes to anyone who wants to answer, but I was just wondering, like, kind of looking towards the future, once assuming that everything that you've wanted goes to plan and everything goes smooth, what is the next step after developing these heroin assisted treatment sites? So like what comes after that?
Can I just say, ask you to introduce yourself too? I should have said this before. So just who are you?
Yeah. My name's Ted. I'm a fourth year communications student at SFU.
Thank you. Thank you.
So you want to know what's next?
Yeah.
What's? Who can answer that? You can answer that. Well, what's next is I think we set up clinics to serve the people that need that drug, and I don't know, we go from there. I mean, it's not really hard to predict what the future might look like, but I think that we would save a lot of lives. I mean, we got to remember that 922 people died last year in this province. Yeah, it's so sad, it's like I feel an urgency to do something about it, and their deaths, it's not in vain, but these are people we can't even find out their names. We don't even know who they are, half of them. At Vandu they get phone calls from Ontario and all over the country saying, "Have you seen my son?" And they give out a name, and we don't know that person by that name. I mean, the other day they told me Monkey Man was dead. Well, who the hell is Monkey Man? I couldn't. They had to tell me, and slowly I began to realize who it was. He's hanging out in a certain area, and that's what we're dealing with in a lot of this, and it's really, really sad that we can't do something about it. And part of doing something about it would be to get people into treatment, and like Dr. MacDonald was saying, once people come in the door, they're offered all services. A lot of times it's their first contact with health care, to treat some of the underlying issues. They've lived in homelessness and horrible housing conditions, and this is their first time actually being offered like some kind of services and help along the way, and they're really surprised by the whole thing.
Yeah, I'll add to that. From our perspective, when we look at the legal battles that have happened around Crosstown, it's very difficult to get the government to do something, to force them to take action. It's a lot easier to prevent them from taking something away once you've proven that somebody's security of the person, their life is at risk. So one of the things that made this all possible, of course, was Crosstown sticking out and making those applications to Health Canada for the SAP. And as Dr. MacDonald said, there was no guarantee that was going to be accepted. In fact, I think everyone was probably a little bit surprised that it was. But once you get through the door, once you're actually providing the service, it's a lot harder for the government to take it away from you. So, from our analysis, one of the best ways to expand is people have to take the chance. They have to put themselves out there. We have to start providing the service and then make it harder for the government to take it away from us. A great example of that is the overdose prevention sites that have popped up in reaction to the crisis. It's all about doing kind of a guerrilla response of doing it unsanctioned, providing the service, and then making it impossible for the government to take it away, because to do so would be clearly wrong.
Okay, thank you. Right here, then over here, and then someone back here.
Hello, Rodney Glenmorris, addiction doctor. I find a lot of my patients have chronic pain from teeth, and unfortunately, like advanced countries like Turkey and Poland, we don't have comprehensive dental care in our health service, which we're told is the envy of the world. That was one thing. The other thing is that heroin is used for childbirth in Scotland. Cannot one obtain heroin from Scotland?
No. They don't make it for export. So we have to get it from Switzerland, which makes it for export. But it needs to be produced here in order to make it feasible and for the diacetylmorphine, the prescription heroin part of this to roll out. I just want to, I'm going to have to step out. I want to thank everybody for the opportunity to talk about what we're doing at Crosstown. But I've been invited to speak at the University of Morgantown in West Virginia about what we're doing in Crosstown. They're facing an opioid crisis there, just like we are here. So I'm running to catch a plane. Thank you.
we're going to take more questions. So thank you very much, Scott, and good luck. We're going to take we'll take 3 questions just to get 3 of them out here because we're a little backed
I
up.
never really got to ask my question. I was just asking for clarification.
No, look, we have
a question I want
we
to
have
know.
a lot of hands up, sir. We have a lot of hands up.
I have a very important question. Yes, it's the most important question.
It is the most important, right? So we're gonna save it till the end.
Does anyone want to hear what I have to ask? I want to ask that man over there. Why is it if the natural substance grown in the earth does not cause as much addiction as the synthesized pharmaceutical product, then why do you try to treat the addiction with a more synthesized product rather than not ingest the original poppy? I want to know.
All right.
Okay, maybe there's a chemical explanation. Can you explain it?
Microphone's coming.
That's injectable. And it is refined from the opium poppy. That's how it is produced.
Nothing is finer than God's creation. Nothing is finer.
We're going to take 3 questions this time. One right here. This person's been waiting. Yeah.
My name is Mike Hansen. I'm an aspiring politician. I'm a shit disturber in this city. I have. This is very perplexing. This whole program here. You got to understand, an overdose is the highest high an addict can achieve. Think about it, the highest high. And they'll keep going back if you let them. On one hand, we got drug suppliers making millions of dollars on the street. On the second hand, we got pharmaceutical companies making millions of dollars off of the problem. And on the third hand, we have taxpayers paying for the whole ticket. Wow. Listen, if you have a playground with a viper pit in it, do you give all the kids anti-venom pens and 911 cell phones so they can help their playmates? Or do you get rid of the vipers? What gives the drug suppliers the control of this city? That's what I want to know. Are there any VPD or RCMP present today? Maybe they could answer this for us.
Is this a question?
This is a question. This
okay.
is
Okay.
Who's going to help us?
Who's going to help us? Can we go to another question? Who else? Right here and then right here. Sorry.
Dave, do you want to say, Dave?
We're gonna
question.
No, we're gonna do 3 questions, then you're gonna get a chance to answer them. We're just trying to catch up with the questions rather than one at a time. Let's get this other question out and then 2 questions, then you can answer the question, Dave.
Well, I was just wondering if there's been any interest from any local producers at all in leading the, creation of heroin in Canada.
Did you get that question? Yeah. Okay, good. And the 3rd question, and then we'll turn over to the panel. Right here. Yeah.
It's been said that this only is a treatment that's applicable to a small number of people. Just what's the percentage of those that are dependent on opioids that don't respond to regular traditional treatment?
Could you say who you are, please?
My name is LJ.
Okay.
I'm just a member of the public.
Thank you.
I got an answer for.
So first question?
Yeah, for the first question. Just legalize dope. That's it. Legalize it. That answers all the questions. That's the only answer. That is the answer we need.
So I would agree with that and say that that would take organized crime out of the picture and legalize and regulate it, and I don't know who's going to run it, the government or some private companies or whatever, but it would be much better than having organized crime involved in it. And then we would actually save the next generation of children and young people, because the only way they could get it is from the government. And I don't think the government's going to start feeding, young children drugs. Whereas in organized crime, people and drug dealers are going to sell to anybody that comes along with money in their hand. What is a kid's lunch money or whatever? They'll sell to anybody. So I think the whole thing is to legalize and regulate it. And some people think that's a tough decision. It's not really. It's really simple. You know, it's just going to take the will to do it. You know, we just have to cross that 51% or whatever. Terry Lake right now says we're not ready for. The health minister of British Columbia is saying, well, we're not really ready for expanding heroin-assisted treatment because the public's not ready. He said, my idea is the public is ready. The public is ready to learn more and to be taught more about this situation and to be presented with the evidence. The scientific evidence shows this. I don't think there's anything that's been studied more over the last 20 years than heroin-assisted treatment, and the verdict is unanimous.
Yeah,
you know?
I'm in favor of it. And I've got a flip side to these questions. I was reading in this National Crime magazine. Did you know that 63% of all the people in jail are in for drugs? 63%. Now, do you really think that the guys that are working in them institutions and that the police forces want drugs legal? No way. They want to be able to drive around and bust you. You know, they want to fill them jobs for, you know, with people in jail. You know, I got 2 years for 5 pounds of pot when I was 21 years old. Can you imagine what I would have got today? $50 fine. So, you know, there you go. The jails are full, 63%. It's amazing. 63% are drug-related offenses.
Okay, a couple of the other 2 questions. People want to respond? Panelists?
I think probably Dr. MacDonald was best suited to answer those ones, but I have heard that there is hope that there's going to be a producer in Canada. It doesn't have to be local necessarily, obviously, for it to be available, since it's a federal drug identification number that's needed. There is talk about somebody who's hopefully going to fill that role. You know, obviously one of the themes that is continual through all of this is that all of these steps seem to take quite a long time. So right around the corner could still mean 6 months, a year, 2 years, exactly. Like it's
Does anybody know a drug manufacturer or president of a drug?
Yeah, if you know any names.
Anyone know who's selling seeds? I want to plant some.
Susan, do you have any comment on either of the?
It was to the young woman who asked about the percentages. To start off with, you know, the percentage of people who do become addicted to narcotics is very low. And most people who try, you know, I'm not going to talk about cannabis, but other criminalized drugs, they don't end up having problematic or dependent or addicted, you know, use of those drugs. So it's a very small percentage that we're talking about anyway. But those who would then become long-term heroin users or narcotic users is even smaller. They talk about it in Switzerland and in the studies that it's probably, you know, like 2 to 3% of people who are sort of more long-term narcotic users. And for those who don't find that conventional treatments work for them, that the heroin-assisted treatment is very successful.
Okay, we have time for a couple of more questions. There's a woman over here who I forgot and missed. My apologies. And someone in the back here, and someone over there. And so we'll say that the last 3 questions. Okay?
So my question
What's your
is,
name?
I'm Erica Thompson. I work in Abbotsford at the Warm Zone. So I work at a drop-in center that's for women. And we've been doing a lot of work, and we're really big on the community ownership, and we think that we're in this really good place, like you say, about ownership. And when you're talking about, you know, in the model where you could actually have a referendum on the vote, and this kind of movement, because I can see the type of the climate in the community, but we're still very, very old school, conservative ideology, especially out in Abbotsford. Yet, what's interesting is that we've got some buy-in of champions. Like we've got one of the doctors that, you know, 3 years ago was prescribing for naloxone before you could even have it, who's involved, who's doing a lot of intersectional with like the syndemic approach, right? So if we're looking at like sex policy laws, if we're looking at drug policy laws, if we're looking at human rights, really, and being able to stop working in silos, including with advocacy, it's all very much like-minded. So how can we all support you, and you support us in return in our community where we can feel and we're advocating, and we have been for years, and we've made headway, but yet we get to a certain point where we need the backing. I also want that to protect the doctors, because I'm hearing a lot of things that are happening to the doctors who are they're coming forward and they're taking these risks because it's the right thing to do. What can we do to protect them and back them, right, as advocates and moving forward? And talking to the physicians and surgeons, and making sure that they're protected and that they don't get their licensing taken away. Because I've seen this with methadose and I've seen this with Suboxone, and they're scared. And I want to be able to back these doctors who are doing the right things. They're in these places and they're making changes along multiple levels, this syndemic approach, and remove that. That's what I'd like to know. How can we get help in supporting all of these initiatives?
Okay, thank you. Back here.
Hi.
Okay, there you are.
I just have a question, whether it's...
Who are you?
Oh, I'm Alex. I'm an interior designer. I actually...
All right. Do you design drugs?
Sorry? I don't design drugs. No, actually 2 weeks ago I was just driving to work, and on my way to work I was flagged down by somebody and assisted in doing chest compressions for 6 minutes until the paramedics could get there to help. Thank you. And obviously this is a huge community issue at this point. I think everyone in this room is interested and invested, but kind of what that other woman was saying is that there's still a lot of conservative opinions on this, and a lot of people that aren't interested in it and don't really have an empathetic response to drug users as an individual. And I know there was a statistic on the savings of treatments like this. So is there a plan to, I don't want to say market, but to kind of give this information out to the population in a different way that might engage them versus focusing on an addicted individual? And is there a way to get people interested in, okay, this is better for the community in terms of money saving? Is that something that these organizations are working on together? Is that something that you need more from community members and their voices?
Okay, great, thank you. We got. How do we back the doctors? How do we promote this program better?
My name's Carrie, I'm an outreach worker, and my question is, if hydromorphone is accessible, why can't we just start with that? Start opening clinics with hydromorphones?
The microphone wasn't on, so how can we start with hydromorphone? How can we do that if it's easier to get, available, cheaper? Scott's not here, of course.
There's a lot of us that the hydromorphine doesn't work. Like I vomit violently when I take the oral hydromorphine. I don't know why, but I can go downtown and buy some Dilaudid and shoot it in my vein, and I'm okay. It takes my sickness away. But if I drink it orally, I vomit violently. I'm sick for the rest of the day. I don't know what it is, but I'd say 4 out of 10 people can't take it orally. So hydromorphine's got something in it that people reject.
Isn't it injectable hydromorphone they want to bring to the...
Yeah, I think part of the answer is funding.
Funding is a big part of the answer, that's true. Who's going to pay for it? That's what they say. Sure, we'll take it, but who's going to back the payment of it?
Yeah, and I think what Greg was saying initially too is part of the answer here is that hydromorphone Dilaudid doesn't work for everybody, and so they want to expand, as he said, the toolbox. And so heroin assisted treatment does work for some, for people as well. And so it's to be able to offer them, more than one thing.
Can I just expand on? You see, the only way the special access program throughout Canada, this was a program that was designed back in the 1950s, and it doesn't meet the needs of the people today. Special access was originally designed for end-of-life, terminal cases, and people who really needed the drug, and that's the way it's written up. It's not designed to treat drug addiction at all. So all of that would have to be rewritten to meet the needs of people today. That would be the way heroin assisted treatment diacetylmorphine could continue and expand. As with the hydromorphone, I think we're ready to go. The thing is, who's going to pay for it? And with the election coming up in BC in May, and the health minister we have now, Terry Lake, is retiring. They don't want to move on it right now. So it's a government thing. Even though people are continuing to die every day.
Take it out of enforcement money.
Of course, we know the answer. We, the people in this room, know the answer. I mean, we're stuck in politics rules everything in our society. I mean, just about, you know. And the people have to. I mean, it shouldn't be that we have to get to the tipping point of the 51% or whatever it is to make action happen. I think we just have to get through this election, and hopefully we'll get some action from the government. Or we will insist on some action from the government.
I'd like to make a comment on what that lady said. 2 weeks ago, there was an overdose. I was walking on my way to the clinic to get my daily shot, and there was 2 people laying on the ground ODing. One guy was almost dead. I had my naloxone kit with me, and a police car pulled up. Just as I pulled it up and started sucking up the rig to give him to help him, he would not let me do it. He would not let me give it to him. So the police need to be brought up to par on it too. He refused to let me. He told me he was going to charge me, and if that man died, he was going to charge me as accessory to murder, manslaughter.
The question, Doug wants to comment too.
Oh, and just to finish off, what I did is I started arguing with him, and I got a friend of mine to give him a whack in the ass with the rig I had pulled up.
Do you want to comment?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly frustrating to hear those stories because, you know, education is a huge part of this, and we spent a lot of time educating with the police department about the fact that the last thing they should be doing is trying to prevent or intervene someone from administering naloxone. And one of the problems that we have in our structures, you'll hear the chief of police and the higher ups in the police force saying, oh yes, we completely understand, that never happens. But the reality on the street is often very different. And getting to those individual police officers, just like getting to some of the general members of the public who don't actually take the time to learn about this issue, is probably the biggest, I guess, challenge that we have in expanding and pushing this to the future. The plug that I'll make is that I think everybody can be an ambassador for heroin-assisted treatment. It's not that complicated when you start to look at the simple facts around it and the obvious benefits of it. So absolutely, as we go about our daily lives, every single one of us should be doing what we can. I'll make a plug for a podcast that recently came out. It was called the Cited Podcast locally. It was distributed in the United States under Life of the Law. It's a podcast that gives basically what you heard tonight in a very polished kind of, under an hour rundown of how Crosstown operates, all the issues with heroin-assisted treatment, and makes a very, very strong case for why that needs to be expanded. If you engage in a discussion with someone and you need to give them something to listen to, that's an absolutely great thing for them to listen to. And from the question about how do we assist the medical community in pushing forward, absolutely from our perspective as lawyers, we need to be there to back them up. And I think what they need, just like what we needed here in Vancouver, which was successful, is people like these right here on the table. People who have actually experienced it, who can tell their personal story. Because I think probably most of us can agree. We can argue about the law, we can talk about the medical benefits. The thing that really sways people and really convinces them that heroin-assisted treatment is necessary is when you hear personal individual stories, and it just hits you right in the heart, and it makes you realize how important this is. So I encourage everybody to keep talking about that.
The psychotherapy that went along with the drug.
We've also handed out a sheet. There is an election coming up, so there's a sheet with a bunch of politicians' names, addresses on them. So another way we can support this marketing of it is to get people to know it, get politicians to understand that there is a constituency out here and there is a treatment gap. So one last question.
I know it's very simple. I know where CDPC's donate button is, and I know where Pivot's donate button is, but I don't know where SNAP's donate button is. How do we give money to SNAP?
Great question.
Well, we get our funding from Vancouver.
Oh, so we should give money to Vandu?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank
We
you.
definitely should give them.
I'd just like to thank our panelists for coming and speaking from the heart and speaking from the mind, and thank you all for coming tonight and expressing your interest and concern about how to scale this up and how to get this happening. Thank you.